On the morning of September 6, 1960, in a press conference room at the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Moscow, two American men sat at a table facing dozens of international journalists and cameras from news organizations across Europe, Asia, and North America. William Hamilton Martin, 29 years old, and Bernon F. Mitchell, 31 years old, wore dark suits and ties. Both men appeared composed but serious as they prepared to make statements that would confirm what United States intelligence officials had feared for more than 2 months. They had defected to the Soviet Union, and they had brought with them comprehensive knowledge of America's most closely guarded cryptographic secrets. The room was crowded with reporters, Soviet officials, and embassy representatives. Cameras clicked continuously as photographers documented the moment. Soviet Foreign Ministry officials sat at either end of the table, prepared to facilitate translation and manage the proceedings. Martin and Mitchell had prepared written statements, which lay on the table before them. In approximately 1 hour, they would reveal details about the National Security Agency that most Americans and most members of the U.S. government had never heard before. 78 days earlier, on June 25, 1960, both men had failed to report for their shifts at the NSA's headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland. By that evening, NSA security officials had initiated an investigation that would eventually conclude with the devastating realization that two cryptanalysts with access to some of the most sensitive intelligence operations in American history had vanished and had likely taken their secrets with them to Moscow. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War intelligence operations and the real human cost behind defection cases, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these documented cases every week, bringing you the truth behind some of history's most consequential betrayals. The disappearance began unremarkably. On June 25, 1960, NSA supervisors noted that both cryptanalysts had failed to arrive for their scheduled shifts. According to later security reports, initial concern was minimal. Employees occasionally called in sick or arrived late. By mid-morning, when neither man had called to explain their absences and neither could be reached at their residences in Laurel, Maryland, supervisors contacted the NSA security office. Security personnel attempted to reach both men by telephone throughout the morning without success. By early afternoon, a security officer was dispatched to their apartment complex. The building manager reported that he had not seen either man for several days, though both had paid rent through the end of June. A check of the parking lot confirmed that neither man's vehicle was present. By late afternoon, NSA security officials began treating the simultaneous absence of two cryptanalysts who worked in the same highly sensitive division as a potential security incident. Personnel files were examined. Colleagues were questioned about whether Martin or Mitchell had mentioned travel plans or had exhibited unusual behavior. The investigation revealed that both men had taken scheduled vacation time beginning June 21st. On June 27th, when neither man had returned or responded to repeated calls, the NSA initiated a formal missing persons investigation. Searches of both apartments discovered that most personal belongings remained in place, but that certain items were conspicuously absent: passports, some clothing, personal papers, and small valuables. Everything suggested voluntary departure with no intention of returning. The critical break came on June 30th when the State Department reported that passport control records showed both men had departed the United States through Washington National Airport on June 21st, traveling separately on flights to Mexico City, departing within hours of each other. This information, combined with their continued absence, led investigators to a disturbing conclusion. Two NSA cryptanalysts with top-secret security clearances had likely defected. Vice Admiral Lawrence Frost, director of the NSA, was briefed on July 1, 1960. That same day, the White House was notified. President Dwight Eisenhower, already dealing with fallout from the May 1960 U-2 incident in which an American spy plane had been shot down over the Soviet Union, now learned that 2 employees of the nation's most secret intelligence agency had disappeared and were presumed to have fled to the Soviet Union. The immediate priority was damage assessment. Teams of NSA analysts reviewed what classified information Martin and Mitchell had accessed during their employment, what operations they had worked on, and what they could potentially reveal to Soviet intelligence. According to declassified portions of the 1961 NSA damage assessment and later congressional testimony, Martin and Mitchell had detailed knowledge of U.S. success in intercepting and decrypting certain Soviet military and diplomatic communications. They knew the locations and capabilities of NSA listening posts around the world, including facilities in Turkey, Japan, West Germany, and the United Kingdom. They understood the technical capabilities and limitations of NSA computing equipment used for cryptanalysis. They had worked on operations targeting Soviet military installations and communications networks. They knew specific techniques the NSA employed to defeat Soviet encryption methods. They were familiar with NSA organizational structure, operational procedures, and personnel assignments. Perhaps most damaging, Martin and Mitchell could provide Soviet intelligence with a comprehensive picture of which Soviet communications systems had been penetrated and which remained secure. This knowledge would allow the Soviet Union to close vulnerabilities, change encryption procedures, and implement countermeasures that would blind American signals intelligence for months or years. The political and intelligence implications were severe. The Eisenhower administration was already under pressure following the U-2 incident. The revelation that 2 NSA cryptanalysts had defected would represent another major embarrassment and would raise serious questions about security procedures at the nation's most classified intelligence agency. The decision was made to keep the defection as quiet as possible while attempting to determine their location and assess the full extent of damage. Throughout July and August of 1960, Martin and Mitchell remained invisible to the Western world. U.S. intelligence agencies had no confirmed information about their whereabouts, though the assumption was that they had reached the Soviet Union and were being debriefed by the KGB. During this period, NSA analysts began noticing changes in Soviet communications patterns that suggested the Soviets were responding to compromised systems. Previously readable encrypted messages became unreadable. Soviet military units implemented new communications security procedures. The evidence strongly suggested that Martin and Mitchell were providing detailed information to Soviet intelligence officers. What U.S. officials did not know was that Martin and Mitchell had indeed reached Moscow and had been undergoing intensive debriefings since late June. According to later accounts from Soviet sources and declassified CIA reports on defector protocols, the 2 Americans were held in a KGB facility outside Moscow, where teams of intelligence officers and technical specialists methodically extracted information about NSA operations, cryptographic techniques, and signals intelligence capabilities. The debriefings were conducted in English, with translators present. Martin and Mitchell were treated well, provided with comfortable accommodations, adequate food and recreational facilities, but were kept under constant supervision and were not permitted to contact anyone outside the KGB facility. The information they provided was extraordinarily valuable to Soviet intelligence. For the first time, Soviet officials gained comprehensive understanding of the scope and sophistication of American signals intelligence operations. They learned which of their communications systems had been penetrated, which codes had been broken, and which facilities were under surveillance. Armed with this knowledge, Soviet military and intelligence services began implementing countermeasures that would significantly reduce American intelligence collection capabilities. To understand how William Martin and Bernon Mitchell came to be sitting in a Moscow press conference room in September 1960, it is necessary to understand who they were and how they came to work at one of the most secret agencies in the American government. William Hamilton Martin was born on November 27, 1931, in Columbus, Georgia. According to declassified background investigation files, Martin demonstrated early aptitude for mathematics and was described by teachers as intellectually gifted but socially reserved. He graduated from Georgia Institute of Technology in 1953 with a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics. Following graduation, Martin was drafted into the U.S. Navy, where his mathematical abilities led to assignment at a Navy communications facility working with cryptographic equipment. After his honorable discharge in 1955, he applied for employment with the NSA in early 1956. His security clearance was approved, and he was hired in August 1956. Bernon F. Mitchell was born on March 11, 1929, in San Francisco, California. According to background investigation records, Mitchell excelled academically and graduated from California Institute of Technology in 1951 with a degree in mathematics. Like Martin, Mitchell was drafted into the Navy and assigned to signals intelligence work. After completing military service in 1953, Mitchell pursued graduate studies at Stanford University, earning a master's degree in mathematics in 1954. He applied to the NSA in late 1955. Investigators noted that Mitchell had expressed interest in traveling to the Soviet Union and had told classmates he believed Americans should learn more about Soviet society. However, investigators concluded this represented intellectual curiosity rather than ideological sympathy with communism. Mitchell's clearance was approved, and he was hired in February 1957. Both men were assigned to the NSA's Office of Research and Development, working in sections focused on Soviet military communications. It was in this context that Martin and Mitchell met and quickly formed a close friendship. According to later testimony from colleagues, the two men discovered shared interests in mathematics, chess, classical music, and hiking. Both were somewhat socially isolated within the agency. By mid-1957, Martin and Mitchell were spending considerable time together outside work. In early 1958, both men rented apartments in the same complex in Laurel, Maryland. They carpooled to work, shared meals, and spent most free time together. To colleagues at the NSA, they became known as a pair. Martin and Mitchell were spoken of as a unit. The nature of their relationship has been the subject of historical debate and remains unresolved. Post-defection government investigations questioned whether their close friendship was romantic in nature, focusing particularly on Mitchell's sexuality. Both men's bachelor status and living arrangements raised questions among investigators. However, neither man publicly confirmed or denied the nature of their relationship, and definitive documentation does not exist. What is documented is that both men were acutely aware that homosexuality was classified as a mental illness in the 1950s, was illegal in most states, and was considered a severe security risk by government agencies. Discovery of homosexuality was grounds for immediate dismissal and security clearance revocation. By 1958, both cryptanalysts had gained access to increasingly sensitive information. Their work involved analyzing Soviet military communications, studying encryption methods, and contributing to efforts to break Soviet codes. In later FBI interviews and congressional testimony, former colleagues stated that both Martin and Mitchell occasionally expressed political views that were unusual within the NSA. Several colleagues recalled conversations in which Martin questioned the morality of U.S. nuclear policy. Mitchell was known to argue that Americans were subjected to propaganda about the Soviet Union and that Soviet society was more complex than government narratives suggested. According to statements Martin and Mitchell later made in Moscow, their decision to defect emerged gradually between 1958 and 1960. Both men claimed their motivations were primarily political rather than personal. They stated they had become troubled by what they viewed as aggressive U.S. foreign policy, particularly regarding nuclear weapons and the risk of nuclear war. Martin told Soviet journalists he believed the United States was preparing for a first-strike nuclear attack against the Soviet Union. Mitchell expressed concerns that U.S. policy was pushing the world toward nuclear annihilation. These stated motivations must be evaluated carefully. Defectors seeking to justify their actions have strong incentives to frame decisions in ideological terms rather than personal ones. The psychological and social pressures both men faced as potential targets of the era's anti-gay persecution, living in fear of exposure in a society and government that criminalized homosexuality, likely contributed significantly to their alienation and their decision to flee. The planning for defection appears to have begun in early 1960. Martin and Mitchell needed to leave the United States without alerting NSA security. They decided to take scheduled vacation time, which would provide several weeks before absence would be considered unusual. They chose to route travel through Mexico and Cuba rather than attempting to enter the Soviet Union through Europe, where U.S. intelligence had greater surveillance capabilities. On June 21, 1960, Martin and Mitchell left their apartments and drove separately to Washington National Airport. They had told colleagues they were taking vacation. Martin mentioned visiting family in Georgia. Mitchell said he planned hiking in Virginia. Both packed minimal luggage. They boarded separate flights to Mexico City, arriving within hours of each other on the evening of June 21st. The journey from the United States to the Soviet Union required coordination with Soviet officials. In Mexico City, Martin and Mitchell made contact with representatives from the Soviet embassy. Available evidence suggests Soviet officials in Mexico City had been alerted to expect 2 Americans seeking assistance. The Soviets arranged transportation for the next leg of the journey. On June 22nd, Martin and Mitchell boarded a Cubana de Aviación flight from Mexico City to Havana. Cuba had recently established close ties with the Soviet Union following Fidel Castro's revolution, and Havana had become a transit point for individuals traveling to the Soviet bloc. Martin and Mitchell spent one night in Havana at accommodations arranged by Cuban officials coordinating with Soviet intelligence. On June 23rd, the 2 Americans boarded an Aeroflot flight from Havana to Moscow. The flight, which included a refueling stop, landed at Moscow's Sheremetyevo Airport on the evening of June 24, 1960. William Martin and Bernon Mitchell had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. KGB officers met them at the gate and immediately transported them to a secure location where their debriefing would begin. For more than 2 months, Martin and Mitchell remained hidden from the world while providing detailed information to Soviet intelligence. During this period, U.S. officials struggled to assess the damage and prepare for the possibility that the defection would become public. The Eisenhower administration hoped the matter could be kept quiet, but Soviet officials had different plans. The decision to hold a public press conference was made by Soviet authorities for propaganda purposes. The defection of two NSA cryptanalysts represented a significant intelligence victory, but it also represented an opportunity to embarrass the United States and to expose American intelligence operations. On September 6, 1960, at the press conference in Moscow, William Martin spoke first. Reading from a prepared statement, he told assembled journalists that he had worked for the NSA for 4 years and had become convinced that the agency was engaged in operations that violated international law and threatened world peace. He stated that the NSA intercepted communications of U.S. allies without their knowledge or consent, collected information on American citizens in violation of constitutional protections, and supported military planning for aggressive war. Martin specifically claimed that the NSA had intercepted communications from Italy, France, Turkey, Uruguay, Indonesia, and several other countries, including American allies. He stated that this surveillance demonstrated that U.S. government claims about respecting sovereignty and international law were hypocritical. He described the NSA as an organization operating in secrecy without meaningful oversight, accountable to no one, collecting vast amounts of information without regard for legality or morality. Bernon Mitchell followed with similar statements. He emphasized what he claimed were NSA operations against neutral and allied countries, stating that ordinary citizens of these nations had no idea their communications were being intercepted and analyzed by American intelligence. He claimed that the scope of NSA surveillance was far broader than the American public understood, and that the agency represented a threat to privacy and civil liberties worldwide. Both men stated they had not been coerced into defecting and had made their decision freely based on moral convictions. They claimed they expected to live in the Soviet Union, had been treated well since their arrival, and looked forward to contributing to what they described as a more peaceful society. The Moscow press conference created international headlines. Western newspapers reported the defection as a major intelligence disaster for the United States. The New York Times ran front-page coverage describing the revelation as potentially the most damaging security breach in NSA history. European newspapers questioned whether their government's communications were being intercepted by American intelligence, creating diplomatic tensions with U.S. allies. The U.S. government's response was swift. The Department of Defense issued a statement acknowledging that Martin and Mitchell had been NSA employees, but disputing their characterizations of agency activities. Officials stated that both men had betrayed their country, violated their oaths and security clearances, and that their defection was motivated by personal rather than political reasons, a veiled reference to speculation about their sexual orientation. Several U.S. officials, speaking to journalists on background, suggested that Martin and Mitchell were homosexuals who had defected to avoid exposure. This narrative, that the defection was driven by sexual deviance rather than political conviction, became central to government efforts to delegitimize Martin and Mitchell's stated motivations. The strategy was effective in shaping American public opinion, particularly among conservative audiences. However, it also reinforced the narrative that homosexuality represented a security risk, leading to intensified discrimination against gay and lesbian government employees. The operational damage was extensive. The NSA's 1961 damage assessment concluded that rebuilding compromised capabilities would require years and millions of dollars. Soviet forces, armed with comprehensive knowledge of which systems had been penetrated, implemented sweeping countermeasures. Within weeks, NSA analysts noticed Soviet communications patterns changing dramatically. Previously readable messages became unreadable, confirming that Moscow was responding to Martin and Mitchell's revelations. The damage extended beyond operational compromise. Allied intelligence services, particularly Britain's government communications headquarters, which worked closely with the NSA, lost confidence in American security measures. Foreign governments that had shared intelligence with the United States questioned whether their information was secure. The Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, comprising the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, conducted extensive reviews of information-sharing protocols and security procedures. The defection prompted comprehensive changes in NSA security procedures and congressional oversight. The agency implemented enhanced personnel security protocols, more frequent reinvestigations, expanded polygraph testing, and stricter information controls. Congress held closed hearings examining the failures, producing reports that identified security gaps but found no evidence of communist infiltration. However, the focus on homosexuality as a security risk intensified, contributing to what historians have termed the Lavender Scare, a systematic purge of gay and lesbian employees from government agencies that paralleled anti-communist purges. Thousands of government employees lost jobs or were denied employment because of sexual orientation, often based on rationale that homosexuality created security vulnerabilities, a rationale justified in part by pointing to cases like Martin and Mitchell. The irony is profound. Martin and Mitchell became security risks not because of their sexual orientation, but because they had access to sensitive information and developed political views that led them to question their loyalty to the United States. Their potential homosexuality created vulnerability only because it was criminalized and stigmatized. Had they been able to live openly without fear of persecution, they would have had nothing to hide and potentially no reason to feel alienated from the society they served. The security establishment's response, intensifying discrimination against gay and lesbian employees, actually increased rather than decreased security risks by forcing more people into lives of secrecy and deception. For William Martin and Vernon Mitchell, the years following their public appearance in Moscow revealed the reality of defector life. The Soviet government provided them with Moscow apartments, jobs as consultants on technical matters for Soviet intelligence agencies, and monthly stipends. They were granted Soviet citizenship and issued identity documents. However, they remained under continuous KGB surveillance. Their apartments were monitored, their movements restricted, and their contacts carefully controlled. Both men struggled with isolation and cultural dislocation. Neither spoke Russian beyond basic phrases, which limited their ability to interact with Soviet citizens or participate in Soviet society. They were dependent on KGB handlers for most practical matters, from shopping to accessing medical care to navigating Soviet bureaucracy. The ideological haven they had imagined revealed itself as bureaucratic, restrictive, and isolating. According to later interviews with Western defectors living in Moscow, documented in declassified CIA debriefings of repatriated defectors, Martin and Mitchell's close friendship appeared to deteriorate under the pressures of defector life. By 1963, approximately 3 years after defection, the two men were no longer living together. They maintained some contact, but had developed separate lives within the narrow confines available to defectors. According to reports from other defectors, Martin married a Russian woman in the mid-1960s. The marriage appeared to provide stability, though the couple had no children. Mitchell remained single, living alone, and working on technical projects for Soviet agencies. Both men grew progressively disillusioned. The Soviet Union revealed itself as bureaucratic, oppressive, and surveilled, far from the ideological haven they had imagined. According to other Western defectors who knew them, Mitchell became increasingly reclusive during the 1960s and 1970s, spending most time alone. The families Martin and Mitchell left behind suffered lasting consequences. According to later accounts, Martin's parents in Georgia and Mitchell's family in California severed contact after the defection. Both families dealt with shame and social stigma in their communities. Neither family maintained communication with the defectors in subsequent decades. The broader national security implications shaped intelligence policy for years. The NSA implemented comprehensive reforms to personnel security, operational security, and counterintelligence. The intelligence community developed new frameworks for assessing insider threats and for monitoring employees with access to sensitive information. It would take decades for lessons about discrimination to be learned. Not until 1995 did President Bill Clinton issue an executive order stating that sexual orientation could not be the sole basis for denying security clearances. Not until the 21st century did the U.S. government fully abandon the practice of treating homosexuality as a security risk. The Martin-Mitchell defection and the discriminatory policies it reinforced caused harm that lasted more than a generation. William Martin and Bernon Mitchell never returned to the United States. Both men were aware that if they did return, they would face prosecution for espionage, which carried potential sentences of life imprisonment or death. Even after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union dissolved, neither man sought repatriation. By that point, they had spent decades in Russia and had no realistic prospect of rebuilding lives in America. Bernon Mitchell died in Moscow in 2001 at the age of 72. He had spent more than 40 years in Russia, most of that time living alone. His death was not widely reported in Western media, and Russian authorities released no details about circumstances. There is no indication he had any contact with his family in California in the years before his death. He left no public statements reflecting on his defection or his life in the Soviet Union. William Martin lived longer, dying in Moscow in 2017 at the age of 86. He had continued living in Russia until his death. Like Mitchell, Martin left no public statements in later life that provided insight into his perspective on the defection or its consequences. His obituary in Russian newspapers identified him only as a former American intelligence employee who had lived in Moscow since 1960. There was no mention of family in the United States, suggesting he maintained no contact for more than 50 years. The broader question raised by the Martin-Mitchell case concerns how to balance security with individual rights and freedoms. The security apparatus that existed in 1960 treated homosexuality as a disqualifying characteristic for sensitive positions, operating on the assumption that gay and lesbian Americans could not be trusted with classified information. This approach created the very vulnerability it sought to prevent by forcing individuals into lives of secrecy and creating incentives for behavior that undermined security. What is certain is that their defection had consequences that extended far beyond their own lives. The NSA lost valuable intelligence capabilities that took years to rebuild. Allied intelligence services lost confidence in U.S. security measures. Thousands of gay and lesbian Americans faced intensified discrimination and persecution. Two families in Georgia and California lost sons who chose exile over the lives they had built in America. The photograph from the Moscow press conference on September 6, 1960, shows two young men seated at a table wearing dark suits, looking directly at cameras. Martin and Mitchell appear serious but composed, determined but not defiant. They look like what they were, mathematicians and cryptanalysts who had made a decision they believed was principled and who were about to discover that principles alone could not sustain them through decades of exile. In that photograph, captured at the moment their defection became public, Martin and Mitchell faced an unknowable future. The Soviet Union they had chosen would dissolve within their lifetimes. The Cold War would conclude without the nuclear catastrophe they claimed to fear, and they would spend the rest of their lives on the margins of Soviet and then Russian society, valued only for secrets provided decades earlier, isolated from families they had abandoned and the country they had betrayed. What they did know, sitting at that table in Moscow in September 1960, was that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. They had chosen to betray their oaths, their colleagues, and their country. They had justified that choice to themselves as an act of conscience. And they would spend the rest of their lives confronting the question of whether the price they paid and the harm they caused was justified by whatever principles they believed they were upholding. William Martin was 29 years old when he sat at that press conference table in Moscow. He was 86 when he died in Russia, having spent 57 years in a country that was not his home, speaking a language that was not his native tongue, working for an intelligence service that had once belonged to his country's enemy. In between those two moments, the young cryptanalyst and the elderly exile, lay a lifetime spent reflecting on, or perhaps avoiding reflection on, a decision made when he was young that defined everything that followed. The secrets Martin and Mitchell revealed in 1960 are long since obsolete. The cryptographic systems they exposed have been replaced multiple times over. The Cold War they lived through has ended. The Soviet Union they defected to has ceased to exist. What remains is the human cost, the families broken, the lives lived in exile, the discriminatory policies reinforced, and the fundamental questions about loyalty, conscience, security, and freedom that their case raises but does not answer.